The wind outside howled like a wounded animal. In the cold dawn of 873 AD, the bells of a small monastery on the North Sea coast rang wildly. The monks ran barefoot across the stone floor, clutching relics, whispering prayers. The sound of horns echoed in the distance. Viking ships were approaching. Among the frightened faces was a boy, Einar, only 14 years old. His pale skin glistened with fear and sweat. His robe clung to his trembling body. The air smelled of smoke, salt, and fear. From the tall window, Einar could see dark sails on the horizon. The villagers had already fled inland. Only the monks and their sacred treasures remained, or so they hoped. But what the monastery didn't know was that these raiders weren't here for gold alone. They came for something living, something sacred. The door shuddered as axes struck wood. The chanting of monks turned desperate, rising higher and faster. And then silence. The door burst open. A flood of men in furs and iron stormed inside, faces painted black, eyes wild with battle rage. Behind them came a tall woman wrapped in wolfskin, her hair braided with beads and bones. Her eyes gleamed like wet steel. The raiders stepped aside for her. Even their leader bowed. She was a vulva, a seeress, a witch of the old gods. The air grew thick with the scent of her incense. She carried a staff carved with runes and a small pouch tied to her belt. From it hung something dark and shriveled, the shape of a human hand. Einar froze. The vulva's gaze found him. She pointed her staff toward the boy and said in a low, steady voice, "This one still hears the gods." Two warriors dragged Einar forward. His feet slid across the cold floor. The monks shouted, but one by one, they were silenced by blades. The vulva knelt beside the trembling boy. She dipped her fingers in a bowl of dark red liquid, the blood of a fallen monk, and drew a spiral on his forehead. The smell of blood mixed with burning pine and sea salt filled the air. Then she whispered, "Tonight you are Odin's messenger. What happens here is not sin. It is the most sacred act that keeps our world alive." Her words froze Einar's breath. He could feel every beat of his heart echo through his chest. Outside, the fires crackled. The sun vanished behind smoke. The raiders began to chant in rhythm, low guttural sounds like thunder trapped in human throats. The vulva led them deeper into the monastery, to a hidden chamber beneath the altar. The boy followed, shaking. The walls were lined with skulls and carved wooden figures of gods with hollow eyes. In the center stood a table of stone, covered with furs and bronze bowls. One of the warriors laid down a severed head before the vulva. Another placed a human heart in her hands. Einar wanted to scream, but his voice refused to come. The vulva turned to him again, her eyes burning in the dim torchlight. "The living and the dead must meet," she murmured. "Only then can we see what the gods desire." She raised the heart to the ceiling and began to chant words that no one else understood. The sound felt ancient, inhuman, as if it came from beneath the earth. The others joined in. Drums beat. Torches flickered. The air grew heavy. Einar felt something stir inside him, a pressure, a heat, as if invisible hands pressed against his chest. He looked down at the floor and saw bones arranged in patterns, circles within circles. They weren't random. They were symbols, ancient ones, meant to open the way to the world of the dead. Then, as the chanting rose to a deafening roar, the vulva's voice cut through it. The bridge between life and death opens only through flesh. She turned toward the boy. Einar's knees gave way. The warriors grabbed his arms. And at that moment, just before the blade touched his skin, the ground trembled. A gust of cold air swept through the chamber, and the torches flickered out. Darkness. Only the voice of the vulva remained, echoing in the dark. The gods have spoken. The old blood must return. That night, something unimaginable happened in that stone chamber. The Vikings didn't just take gold from the monastery. They took something far more precious, something human. The next morning, the raiders were gone. The monastery was silent, but the villagers who returned said they saw strange markings burned into the stones and bowls filled with blood that never dried. They whispered that the raiders had fed not on bread or ale, but on the hearts of men, believing it gave them power to speak with the dead. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that sealed chamber, I need to show you the system that made it all possible. Before we judge what happened in that monastery, we must understand why it happened. To the Vikings, death was not an ending. It was a door, and only those who knew how to open it could speak with the gods. Their world was ruled by the idea that life and death fed each other like fire and smoke. Every raid, every ritual, every sacrifice was part of a system, one built on blood, honor, and destiny. Imagine a longhouse deep in the fjords. Its roof drips with melting snow. Inside, warriors sit in silence as smoke curls from the hearth. Above them hang shields, swords, and the bones of ancestors. At the far end sits an old man, the Goti, or priest chieftain. He is both ruler and servant of the gods. Beside him stands a woman wrapped in a cloak of raven feathers, the vulva, a seeress. She does not serve the people. She serves only the gods, and even kings bow before her. When she speaks, no one interrupts, because her words could shape fate itself. The Vikings believed the world was born from the body of a giant, and that every life carried a spark of divine flesh. So when blood was spilled, especially human blood, that spark was released, feeding the power of the gods. To them, killing wasn't always murder. Sometimes it was communication. They didn't pray to distant heavens. They fed their gods. Blood was the language. Flesh was the message. So when the vulvas performed rituals with organs and bones, it wasn't madness to them. It was science, sacred, structured, and written into their laws. They believed each organ carried a meaning. The heart was courage. The liver held destiny. The eyes carried memory. During great ceremonies, these were arranged carefully, sometimes eaten, sometimes burned, to send messages to gods or ancestors. And here's the most disturbing part. These rituals weren't done in secret caves or hidden shrines. They happened in front of people, in festivals, before chieftains, even before children. To witness blood was to witness the gods' appetite. The vulvas were the architects of this system. They were not witches hiding in forests. They were respected figures, invited to courts, consulted on matters of law and war. When a new leader rose, it was the vulva who blessed him. When a great voyage began, she was the one who read the omens in animal entrails. And when famine struck, she was the one who demanded blood. If she said the gods required a life, no one refused, because to refuse her was to refuse Odin himself. One of the darkest rituals described in old chronicles was the blot, a blood sacrifice to ensure prosperity. Animals were slaughtered, their blood collected in great bowls. The priest or vulva would dip a branch in the blood and sprinkle it on the idols, on the walls, and on the people. The crowd would cheer, but in the deepest, most private blots, it wasn't just animals. Sometimes it was captives, monks, slaves, or even willing followers who sought eternal honor. To them, dying in ritual meant ascending immediately to Valhalla. That's how far their faith went. The line between holiness and horror blurred. Inside their temples, or hofs, carved figures of gods stood with hollow eyes. Offerings of food, gold, and blood covered the floor. Bones were not buried. They were kept, displayed as reminders that death was part of the living world. And when someone died, their body was arranged according to what role they served in life. A warrior with his sword, a vulva with her staff and her pouch of herbs, a slave sometimes buried alive beside them, so the master would not walk alone in the next world. It was not cruelty in their eyes. It was balance. Even the act of raiding, the terror that shook monasteries like the one Einar knew, was not seen as greed. It was harvest. They believed the sea demanded sacrifice. Every raid that spilled blood on foreign shores was a gift to the gods, ensuring safe winds and fertile land back home. When they struck, they believed Odin rode with them. When they burned, they believed they were purifying the world. This system was recorded not only in sagas, but by outsiders who saw it firsthand. A German chronicler, Adam of Bremen, wrote of temples where sacrifices, even human ones, were performed to seek messages from the dead. He described how priests would hang bodies in trees, believing the soul lingered there long enough to whisper secrets to those who listened closely. And sometimes, the listeners claimed they heard answers. To the Vikings, this was proof that the dead could indeed speak. Through necromancy and rituals of flesh, they sought control over fate itself. The vulvas were said to raise voices of the dead, asking them about the future, about storms, wars, the coming of kings. These sessions were feared and respected because the boundary between prophecy and madness was thin. Sometimes the vulva herself would fall into a trance, her voice no longer her own. When she spoke, her words were treated as divine law. Even the mightiest warriors obeyed. This was the system that ruled the North, a system where blood was holy and death was not feared, it was used. And this is what shaped people like the woman who stood in that monastery and the young boy who trembled before her. To her, the ritual that night wasn't evil. It was duty. It was sacred tradition. It was the way her people had survived for centuries. But the cost of that belief was unbearable. Because when a culture begins to treat blood as sacred currency, it stops seeing human life as human at all. Before we move forward, before we look at how children like Einar were chosen, trained, and prepared for initiation into these terrifying rites, I want you to pause and think. This wasn't chaos. It was organized. It was faith with rules, hierarchy, and purpose. And that's what made it so unstoppable. Subscribe now. This will change how you see history. Comment what you know. Watch till the end for real names and proof. But to truly understand the depth of this darkness, we must descend into its heart to see how these rituals began with children, how they were molded, prepared, and sacrificed in the name of gods and fate. Because Einar was not the first, he was part of a system that began long before him. Before the monastery burned, before Einar's trembling voice joined the chants of the vulvas, his story began in a small coastal village, far from the eyes of kings and gods. He was born during a storm. The elders said the thunder was Odin's voice, and the wind that broke the roof that night was a sign. The boy belonged to the gods. His mother wept, but she did not resist. Because when the seeress came, no one ever said no. Every few years, a vulva would travel through the villages. She carried her staff, her carved box of bones, and a bag of ash from the sacred fires. She would sit in the center of the settlement and call the children forward. They came barefoot, trembling. The air smelled of pine smoke and seawater. She would mark a circle in the dirt, whisper a few words, and cast her runes. If the bones landed in a certain pattern, if the wind shifted, if the crows called, the chosen child was taken. The villagers said it was an honor. But when the vulva's back turned, mothers bit their lips to keep from screaming. Einar was taken at 13. He didn't cry. He didn't fight. He only looked at his mother one last time, and she nodded. Even as tears rolled down her face, he was brought north, to a hidden settlement deep in the fjords. There were other children, boys and girls from faraway lands, some captured, some given. The vulvas called them the chosen blood. The first thing they learned was silence. For days, they were forbidden to speak. They ate cold fish, slept on stone floors, and listened to the wind. The silence, they were told, was to empty their hearts so the gods could fill them. Then came the lessons. They learned the songs of calling, slow, rhythmic chants that could make the skin crawl. They practiced breathing with the waves, watching the fire, and, falling into trance, they learned how to mix herbs that caused visions, mushrooms that made the world twist, roots that burned the throat but opened the mind. They learned the ways of bloodletting, how to cut just enough to bleed, not to die. It was said the gods listened best to those who knew pain but refused fear, and they were trained in dance, because every movement had meaning. The swaying of arms, the spiral steps, these were not art, they were codes. They mirrored the turning of the cosmos, the weaving of fate. At the next spring festival, Einar's trial came. The sky was pale with mist. A great fire burned at the center of the gathering, surrounded by warriors, elders, and the vulvas. The chosen stood in a line, their bodies covered in oil and ash. They were nearly naked, painted with symbols drawn from bone powder. The smell of pine, sweat, and smoke filled the air. The oldest vulva stepped forward and said, "The gods do not hear words. They hear courage." One by one, each child stepped to the fire, holding a small blade. They had to slice their palm, let the blood drip into a bronze bowl, and speak a vow. When it was Einar's turn, he raised his trembling hand. The flame's heat stung his eyes. He whispered, "Let my blood be my voice." The crowd hummed in approval. The Volva nodded. Einar had passed his first test. After that night, things grew darker. The children were brought to caves lined with bones. They were told the bones belonged to ancestors, warriors who demanded to be remembered. They were taught to clean them, to arrange them in sacred patterns. Sometimes they were made to spend entire nights in the dark, surrounded by skulls, until the fear broke, or they claimed to hear whispers. The Volvas said that was the first step toward becoming a true speaker for the dead. They also learned healing, not just of wounds, but of spirit. They made salves from bear fat and moss. They brewed potions to calm or poison, because to serve the gods, they said, one must master both life and death. At 15, Einar's body was strong. His mind was quiet, but his soul was trembling. He had seen things he could not name, shadows moving in the firelight, faces in the smoke. The elders said the time had come for his initiation. That ceremony began at sunset. The air was cold and heavy with salt. The chosen were washed in seawater, then anointed with oils made from pine and whale fat. Drums began to beat, slow and deep. The Volvas led them in a spiral around the fire, chanting words that made the skin crawl, and then came the final act, the union of life and death. A lamb was brought forth, its throat gently cut, its blood was mixed with honey and herbs. The chosen were made to drink a drop each, a ritual of bonding with the sacrifice. The Volva then whispered, "Now you have the taste of the bridge. The next time, it will not be an animal." The words sank deep into Einar's heart like frost. He didn't sleep that night. He watched the fire burn low, and in the flicker of its dying light, he thought he saw faces in the smoke, eyes staring back at him from the world beyond. Not all who trained survived. Some lost their minds. Some vanished after rituals. Their names never spoken again. Those who failed were not punished with death. They were simply forgotten. In Viking belief, being erased from memory was worse than dying. Einar learned to smile when told to bow when commanded, to silence his questions. But deep inside, the boy who once chased gulls by the sea was gone. He had been remade into a vessel, a voice for gods he no longer understood. One winter night, the Volva brought him to the cliffs above the fjord. The moon shone on the water like a blade. She told him to sit and listen. Hours passed in silence, the wind biting his skin. Finally, she said softly, "When you stop fearing death, you will hear the dead speak." And when she said that, he understood the truth. Their rituals were not about gods at all. They were about control. Fear kept the people loyal, pain kept them silent, and belief, that's strange. Burning belief kept the blood flowing generation after generation. When dawn came, the Volva smiled faintly. She placed her cold hand on his chest and said, "You are ready. The gods will use you soon." Those words sealed his fate, leading him a year later to that monastery on the edge of the world. The boy who once dreamed of the sea would soon become the bridge the Volvas always spoke of, the bridge between the living and the dead. But what of those who commanded these rites? The rulers, the warriors, the priests who stood behind the Volvas, who funded, protected, and joined in these rituals of death and devotion? Their world was darker still, and their hunger for divine power knew no limit. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine raiders with axes, burning villages, and stolen gold. But the truth is far darker and far more structured. The elites, the kings, jarls, and priests, were the ones who made the rituals happen. They didn't just watch from the shadows. They joined in, and in doing so, showed that sacred power was not for the weak. Twice a year, the communities held great festivals. In the daytime, they appeared simple: feasts, music, dancing, and storytelling. Children played by the longhouses. Farmers presented harvests. Sailors returned with fish and tales of the sea. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the festivals transformed. The torches burned brighter. The music slowed into deep, pounding drums. The Volvas led the chosen ones, boys and girls trained in secret, into hidden chambers beneath the longhouses, or temples, and the elites followed. One famous account recorded by outsiders, tells of Jarl Hakon, a Viking noble who hosted a midsummer festival. By day, he sat at the high table, receiving gifts, listening to stories, and judging disputes. By night, he descended into the cellar with the Velvas, where the smoke of incense and blood mixed with laughter and chants. Jarl Hakon's presence alone ensured compliance. No one dared question the rituals, not the warriors, not the villagers, not even the priests. The elites had a divine excuse. They were performing duty. Their participation guaranteed the prosperity of the land, the favor of the gods, and their own elevated status. These gatherings were carefully organized. In public, feasts of roasted meats, mead flowing in golden cups, children dancing. In private, chambers of stone and wood, bowls of blood, hearts, and bones arranged in sacred patterns. The chosen young ones, like Einar, were led through these ceremonies. The elites watched, sometimes guiding the rituals, sometimes joining in the consumption of sacred offerings. It was justified. As divine duty, the line between honor and horror blurred. Those who resisted were said to anger the gods, and their fates were grim. One of the most chilling accounts comes from Adam of Bremen, a chronicler of the 11th century. He wrote of temples where rulers and priests together performed rites that included necromancy, sacrifices, and speaking to the dead. In some cases, young captives were brought before the rulers. Their blood was offered, and the elites drank from the sacred bowls, believing it granted insight into the future. Another case, possibly myth, but told for centuries, speaks of a ruler named Sigurd the Wise. During a festival, he stood atop a mound, holding a cup filled with sacrificial blood. The Volvas chanted. The chosen ones circled the mound, painted with symbols of protection and death. The elites drank, laughed, and made vows in the name of Odin. It was a night of divine communion and unthinkable terror for those who served. To an outsider, this seems monstrous. To the Vikings, it was necessary. Kings believed the gods demanded their action. Jarls believed their land would fail without ritual. Priests and Volvas were the interpreters of divine will. No one questioned the morality, only the accuracy. Did the sacrifice bring favor? Did the ritual open the bridge to the dead? If yes, the elite's honor and power increased. If no, the blame fell on the young, the weak, or the unlucky. In other words, the system protected the powerful while consuming the powerless. Outside, the world saw celebration. Inside, the world saw obedience, fear, and blood. The distinction mattered. A festival without secrecy would destroy authority. A ritual without authority would be meaningless. So the elites maintained the illusion of piety, while participating in acts that by modern eyes seem unthinkable. Einar saw all of this when he was taken to a festival at the age of 15. The torches reflected off golden goblets, embroidered cloaks, and polished axes. He saw kings laughing with jarls. He saw priests and Volvas chanting over bowls of blood, and he understood. This was their world, the chosen children. The rituals, the sacrifices, all were tools. The elites were not there for entertainment. They were there to assert power, and he would serve them. History shows that not all rulers maintained honor. Some became addicted to the rituals. Some lost sense of reality. Yet, the structure persisted. It was self-perpetuating. Elites protected Volvas, Volvas guided rulers, and the young were trained to continue the system. Every festival ensured the next festival. Every sacrifice ensured the next ruler's power, and every child taught obedience ensured the cycle continued. The Vikings, often seen as wild raiders, had a complex system of governance, religion, and control, and it revolved around blood and belief. To the outside world, Viking rulers and jarls were warriors, fierce, strong, and relentless. But behind the walls of their halls, they were something else entirely, masters of luxury, manipulation, and hidden desire. Imagine a longhouse perched on a fjord cliff. Its roof is thatched with reeds. Smoke rises from multiple hearths. Inside, the scent of roasted meat mixes with pine, sea salt, and the perfume of oils made from herbs. The Jarl's tables gleam with polished wood and bronze. Goblets filled with mead sparkle like sunlight on water. Servants move silently, offering bowls of fish, bread, and honeyed wine. Every detail speaks of power. Gold and silver hidden beneath cloths, weapons and shields lined along the walls, animal pelts thick and soft underfoot. But the most important treasures are the people, young men and women, trained in ritual, beauty, and obedience. Some are family, some are gifts, some are part of the sacred system. The elites maintained appearances not only for war, but for ritual and influence. Hair was braided with beads and metal rings. Bodies were oiled and perfumed with herbs. Even clothing was coded. Certain colors or patterns marked rank, wealth, or favor with the gods. But the true power lay in seduction. The elite used charm to control allies and rivals alike. A smile, a touch, or a whispered prophecy could decide alliances, marriages, or even life and death. Festivals and private banquets were not merely for eating. They were stages for politics, strategy, and secret agreements. During one feast, a Jarl might sit at the high table, laughing and drinking mead. But beneath the laughter, he observes which warriors are loyal, which servants show fear, which vulvas can be trusted for prophecy. At the same time, rituals might be performed in hidden rooms. A chosen youth might be led into a chamber to offer blood or insight. The elites tasted the sacred offerings, believing it gave them wisdom, luck, and divine favor. Power was not just physical. It was symbolic, mystical, and psychological. Consider Sigurd the Wise, a Jarl described in local sagas. He rose to power not solely through war, but through his knowledge of ritual and manipulation. Of the sacred, he consulted the vulvas. He hosted elaborate festivals. He consumed sacred offerings and positioned himself as chosen by Odin. His influence grew. Warriors obeyed him. Peasants revered him. Other Jarls feared him, but his reliance on ritual also led to his downfall. Misinterpreted omen caused him to attack a neighboring clan. Prematurely, the gods were said to have withdrawn favor. His hall was burned. His body was never found. Power was fragile, even when sanctioned by God's blood. And wealth, beliefs about death and the afterlife were central to elite control. The Vikings believed warriors slain in battle went to Valhalla, the hall of Odin. Those who served in rituals could join the spirits of ancestors. Failing to honor rituals risked being forgotten entirely, a fate worse than death. This system ensured obedience. Elites could promise eternal glory to those who served and erasure to those who disobeyed. Even after death, the influence of these elites lingered, bones kept as symbols, stories told to remember their power, rituals repeated to honor their authority. Life, death, and legacy were tools of control. The combination of wealth, ritual, and fear gave the elite almost godlike authority. They could command armies, manipulate rituals to serve their personal interests, decide the fate of children, warriors, or captives, shape the perception of the gods themselves. Even ordinary villagers learned to fear their judgment. Even powerful warriors obeyed, knowing that blood and ritual could tip the scales of fortune. Einar, now trained and hardened by initiation, understood this more than anyone. He could see the threads, how blood, fear, and devotion were woven into every act of leadership. The elites did not simply rule with force, they ruled with belief, manipulation, and divine authority. But luxury bred corruption. Elites who overindulged in sacred offerings sometimes lost touch with reality. Excessive banquets, alcohol, and ritual indulgence led to poor decisions, conflicts, and even violent rivalries. Yet, the system was self-protecting. Powerful families intermarried. Rituals were public enough to legitimize authority. Disobedience was met with punishment, often death or erasure from memory. The cycle of power, luxury, and ritual continued, binding the living and dead to the same hierarchy. Even in this period of height and grandeur, shadows loomed. Rumors whispered of greed, of exploitation, of failed rituals that brought curses instead of blessings. Some priests and vulvas were said to manipulate elites for personal gain, and every festival, every banquet, Every act of consumption carried a risk, angering the gods, losing favor, or sparking rebellion. The seeds of corruption were already planted. Even the most powerful rulers eventually faced decay. The Viking elites were no exception. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the system of blood, ritual, and fear that had once solidified their authority began to show cracks. Elites, who once acted as intermediaries between the gods and the people, started to abuse their authority. Some Jarls demanded sacrifices not for divine favor, but for personal gain. Certain vulvas manipulated prophecies to favor themselves or their allies. Captives and villagers were coerced into giving blood or service under false pretenses. The same rituals that had once ensured loyalty now bred resentment. Stories began to spread among villages and smaller settlements that some priests were stealing offerings meant for gods, that Jarls secretly enjoyed violence for pleasure, not duty, that the gods themselves had withdrawn favor because of arrogance. Whispers carried far. Merchants traveling between settlements told tales of feasts where the elites gorged themselves while the chosen young wept. Warriors spoke in hushed tones of failed omens and unlucky raids. Even outsiders recorded these events. Chroniclers like Adam of Bremen described temples filled with blood and fear, questioning the morality of such acts. Corruption didn't only weaken the system externally, it changed the elites themselves. The more they indulged in blood rites, feasts, and ritual pleasures, the more detached from reality they became. Some believed themselves invincible, some ignored advice from warriors or other rulers, some became paranoid. Seeing betrayal everywhere, the sacred laws that had once maintained order now fed chaos. Vulvas occasionally misread omens. Sacrifices went wrong. Animals died unexpectedly. Young initiates fainted or refused to participate. These failures, once rare, became more common. They undermined the authority of the elites, making even the bravest warrior question, if the gods no longer answer, are we truly chosen? The result was tension, both public and private. Rival elites plotted against one another. Some Jarls attempted to seize power through violence rather than ritual. To the common people, the elite system was increasingly terrifying. Villagers whispered that their rulers were cruel and capricious. They feared that festivals, once times of celebration, had become nights of horror. Parents hesitated to give children to the sacred training, fearing the fate of young ones like Einar. Even as some feared the gods, many began to fear the men themselves. Outsiders, like German chroniclers, recorded this tension. Vikings were no longer only raiders. They were practitioners of necromancy, magic, and ritual cruelty. Several elite figures whose lives were built on blood and ritual met grim fates. Take Sigurd the Wise, who once rose through careful manipulation of vulvas and sacred rites. His overconfidence led to misjudged battles. A rival jarl ambushed his hall, burning it to the ground. His body was never recovered, a powerful warning to others. Another figure, a vulva named Brynhild the Seer, vanished mysteriously after a failed prophecy. Some said she was punished by the gods. Others said she was silenced by elites who feared her. These examples show that power built on blood and fear is fragile. As Christianity spread across the north, many of these pagan practices were condemned. Temples were destroyed, vulvas were hunted, and rituals that had once cemented power were outlawed. Later generations remembered the elite with a mixture of awe and horror. Scholars highlighted their knowledge of herbs, healing, and astrology, but they also condemned their cruelty, necromancy, and abuse of the young. History shows both admiration for their cunning and fear of their ruthlessness. The story of the Viking elite illustrates a timeless truth. When power is concentrated and sanctified by fear, it corrupts absolutely. Ritual and religion can be tools of control as much as devotion. Even the strongest empires, built on fear and sacred law, are vulnerable to internal decay. Einar, the boy who once trembled in the monastery, lived through these changes. He saw the rise and fall of kings, the corruption of priests, and the collapse of once mighty rituals. By the time he was grown, he understood the ultimate lesson. Power built on blood and obedience cannot last forever. But even as the old system crumbled, echoes remained. Stories of ritual sacrifice and elite indulgence persisted. Legends of Velvas, Jarls, and chosen children like Einar lived on in saga and memory. And while their world changed, the mechanics of elite control, fear, belief, and ritualized obedience survived. Remember Einar, the boy standing in the cold stone monastery? The torches flickering, the vulva chanting over blood and bones, the fear pressing into his chest? He is the lens through which we can understand the entire system, its horror, its beauty, and its moral ambiguity. Ask yourself, was Einar a victim, or was he becoming a participant in a sacred system? Were the vulvas evil, or were they servants of a belief older than kings? Were the Jarls cruel, or were they bound by traditions and fear of losing power? The answer is not simple. The Vikings' world was not ours. To them, what we see as horror was holy. To them, consuming blood and arranging bones was devotion. And yet, even in their own time, some questioned it. Rituals that went wrong, sacrifices misread, failed omens, these were warnings. Whispered in fear and doubt. Power built on fear always faces a mirror. Eventually, it judges itself. Years later, Einar would sit on the cliffs above the fjord. The wind ruffled his hair. The waves below crashed against rocks like the drums of the past. He thought of every child trained, every sacrifice, every elite who had drunk blood in the name of Odin. He had survived, not because he was strong, but because he had learned the system, the rules, and the weaknesses, and he understood something terrible. The cycle would continue as long as fear and belief remained. The boy who trembled in the monastery had become a man who understood how elite power works. And it works the same everywhere, in every age. Broader truth, elite corruption, what Einar learned is universal. Elites gain power through control of knowledge. Only they understand rituals, prophecies and secrets, fear and obedience. The threat of punishment or spiritual condemnation ensures compliance, symbols, and spectacle. Feasts, ceremonies, and displays of power legitimize authority, manipulation of morality. What is sacred is beyond question. What is ordinary is irrelevant. The Vikings were extreme, but the principle is familiar. Blood may not be spilled in our world, but obedience, loyalty, and devotion are still bought and enforced through fear and ritual. History repeats itself. The Viking elite eventually faded, temples burned, vulvas disappeared, Jarls lost battles and heirs, but the stories endured of bravery and terror, of devotion and cruelty, of blood spilled for gods, kings, and fear itself. Einar's story reminds us that human cost is never invisible, even when masked by belief, ritual, or tradition. Standing on the fjord cliffs, Einar remembered the monastery, the torches flickering, the smell of pine and blood, the vulva's eyes sharp and unyielding, his own fear, raw and human, and he realized the system that created those horrors was not mythical. It was built by humans, maintained by humans, and destroyed by humans. Every generation repeats some form of it. The mechanics of fear, obedience, and elite privilege endure. The only difference is the stage, the audience, the victims, and the guise under which it operates. Think of the boy in the monastery. Think of the rituals, the feast, the power, the blood. Ask yourself, are we victims or believers? Are we blind to manipulation when it comes wrapped in tradition or authority? Do we see the signs when power becomes sacred and unchallengeable? History offers lessons, but only if we pay attention. Comment, victims or believers. Subscribe to see more dark truths from history. Share, spread the story. Because understanding prevents repeating. Click the next video. The past is never far away. The saga of Einar ends, but the echoes remain. The Vikings may have disappeared, but the system they perfected, fear, ritual, and elite control, never truly dies. And as long as humans are willing to bow to power without question, history will always have its monsters and its witnesses.